So let's talk about grief and peace. It seems like the two are diametrically opposed and that it's impossible to be at peace when you are grieving, especially when you're in the midst of raw grief, either right after someone has passed or you've suffered a loss, and or you're experiencing grief again. It might be years later, weeks later, months later, after the loss itself. Because grief can be raw no matter what period of time we're talking about from the loss. So I've been there. I know what you mean. I have been in chaos and grieving, and I've also been at peace as I have been in the midst of raw grief. And I think we have a picture or expectations about what peace is, or that peace must be, that if we're at peace, then we are happy, that things aren't quote unquote messy, that we have to be feeling good to be at peace. And when I say feeling good, that's really very subjective. So when I started my conscious journey with grief, I use the word conscious very specifically because I've been grieving many things for many years, and all of us are. It's just that we're not always conscious of it. And a lot of times when we're conscious of it, we don't want to feel it, so we tuck it away somewhere. We compartmentalize it in our lives. We stuff it somewhere because we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to feel it. We don't want to be sad. We don't want to deal with the tears. We're afraid of the intense emotion. And so we put it somewhere because we can't and don't want to deal with it. We're not used to it, and we're not taught how to deal with it in Western culture. So after my sister passed away in 2009, my dad passed away, my sister passed away in 2007, my father in 2009. I suffered some losses of friendships for various reasons. So there was a lot of loss, and they were just stacking on top of each other. And the grief was just, seemed like it was chasing me down everywhere I went. And every single day I was grieving. And some days it was ugly and hard and intense and raw. And there were tears, massive tears. It felt like I wanted to just crawl under the covers and stay there. Other days it was much less intense, but I just felt this heaviness all day long. I felt this undercurrent of sadness, of I guess a heaviness. That's probably my best way of putting that. So there was grief all the time in it. And at some point I just surrendered because there was so much grief and so much sadness that I surrendered to it. And grief became this entity to me. I started calling it, gave it a pronoun, she. Because grief was just chasing me down everywhere I went. And I finally just threw my hands up, metaphorically, and said, okay, if you're going to be around, I'm going to make friends with you. I give up. I'm not going to resist. I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to run anymore. And I just want to be at peace. I want to navigate this more gracefully. I want to be able to walk with you, grief, in a way where I still feel like I have my power, where I still feel like I'm myself, where I still feel like I have a life that I want, that I'm excited about, that I feel good about. I want to live no matter how much I'm grieving. And I want to live fully. I want to thrive. So fighting and resisting just wasn't working. So I said, okay, I'm going to be friends with grief. And what does that mean? I found my peace with grief, in grief, when I became friends with grief. So that meant I didn't run anymore. When grief showed up, I spent time in grief with grief. So I honored my emotion. I vented my emotion when I could in the moment. And sometimes it's just not practical. We're at work, we're running errands, we're doing things with other people, maybe at a social event, whatever it is. But as soon as I could, I spent time in that grief. And yes, in the beginning, it was scary and it was hard because it was so intense. I just thought I wasn't going to make it through. And I learned, because I just didn't want to fight anymore. And I committed to being in the grief and being in my emotion as often as I could, as soon as I could when it was coming up. That I learned that my emotion is nothing to be afraid of. Yes, it's intense. Yes, it's messy sometimes. And I just let it roll through me. And I made it through every single time. I came out on the other side and I felt better. I felt relieved. And if I didn't feel relieved, I realized that I hadn't let it all go. I stopped it for some reason. I thought I was done. Sometimes in the midst of the intense emotion, need to stop, take a breath, kind of go inward and ask yourself, is this all of it? Is this all of it? And if it's not, be willing to go through the rest and feel that emotion until it has all come through you. And do that as often as you can. Be bold, be courageous about that, because it really is the greatest gift. And then I found in successive losses that I was able to navigate through more gracefully and feel a measure of peace within my grieving. And I remember when a kind of a light went off once when I was in intense grief, and I realized, yes, I'm emotional, and yes, I feel peaceful, which meant I felt grounded. I wasn't afraid of what was happening. There was a measure of calm within that grief. Yes, I was still crying. Yes, I was still sad, but I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel untethered to anything. I didn't feel anxious. I was just sad and grounded and okay, and fully embracing whatever was happening at the moment. And in that willingness, in that curiosity about what was happening, in that openness, yes, I felt peaceful. I accepted what was going on. I wasn't resistant to any of it. And that gave me peace. In the sadness, with the sadness. So I just spend time with grief when grief shows up. And that's a thing about friendships. We have to nurture them, spend time with them, be with them, understand them, ask questions, be curious about them, show up when it's time to show up. That there's a give and take. There are times when I know that sadness is coming up and I say to myself, okay, I can't do this fully right now, but I will when I have the space and the time to do it. And if it's so intense that I feel like I don't want to be by myself, I find a trusted friend, somebody who I know can be with me in my grief, in my intense sadness, and not try to stop me, not try to save me from it. Well, they can't, but not try, and not try to get me to just stop the tears and tuck that away. Someone who'll let me fully be in my emotion. And that's valuable, that's highly valuable. So sometimes, if you can't do it by yourself, that's okay. But do it with somebody you trust deeply and thoroughly, somebody you trust with your heart, absolutely. If you don't have one of those people, I can be one of those people for you. Just call me, reach out, email, text, something. I am honored to be with people in their intense sadness and grief. So consider, if you can't be friends with grief right now, if you can't open yourself fully, at least be willing to look at it, to be in it, to spend time, to not resist. And then the more you practice that, at some point, you will be fully open And I believe that you will find a measure of peace within that grief. The biggest thing is just not resisting. It's just being open, being curious, asking questions, and welcoming grief and sadness in when they show up. Welcoming whatever our emotions are, welcoming them in whenever they show up. As soon as we have the time and space to pay attention to them fully. That's the other thing about friendship. Being with whomever it is, and in this case, grief, fully present, fully open, sharing our hearts, opening our hearts, and loving what is, loving what is. It's hard. It's hard. I won't tell you otherwise, but it is an incredible gift, and it's an incredible practice to be open to grief. And I think it'll take you places that you've never been before. It'll raise your emotional intelligence. It will allow you to navigate life, navigate grief more gracefully, with more passion, with more presence. And that, yes, that is an amazing gift to your life. If you have any questions or concerns, reach out always. I wish you peace. Always and always, especially in our grief.